Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? And very clearly? Good, but there's nothing worse than speaking for an hour and no one has understood a word. Well, I must start with two confessions. The first confession is that unfortunately Her Majesty the Queen never knighted me. I'm plain Mr. Tom Bower. And my second confession is I'm never likely to get a knighthood. One of your own kinsmen, Lakshmi Mittal, will tell you the reason why. I met him about 3 years ago when I was writing the biography of Bernie Ecclestone, the godfather and organizer of Formula One racing. We're in Monaco in Bernie Ecclestone's bus, which he uses as his headquarters. It's nicknamed the Kremlin, and that gives you an idea of the godfather powers of Ecclestone. And Lakshmi Mittal came for lunch. We were squeezed around a table, and Bernie Ecclestone told Mr. Mittal exactly the sort of books I write, the sort of people I've taken on in my career, the tycoons and the criminals, and often the criminal tycoons. And Mittal said to me after a pause, he said, "Will you make me a promise?" And I thought to myself, here is this man worth at least $20 billion asking me to promise him something. And I said, "What on earth can I promise you?" And he said, "Just promise me never to write about me." So I come to you to talk about The Squeeze, which was one of the books I most enjoyed writing because it has been one of the most interesting stories of all times, the story of oil. Oil is a dangerous business, as you well know, but it is also the most exciting. Without warning, oil causes explosions in oil fields, mayhem in the markets, and it wrecks economies. The reputations of politicians and tycoons soar on the back of oil, but their reputations also crash when the unforeseen strikes. Many politicians delight in controlling oil prices, while others hate that prices are beyond their control. The world's fate depends on oil, yet geology, technology, markets, human genius, and human folly determine oil prices, and all of that is unpredictable. So that's what makes the oil business so gloriously dangerous and so wonderfully exciting. One day, everyone rages about oil prices. The next day, we're told there are terrible shortages. Peak oil supplies, we're told, are just a couple of years away by the self-proclaimed experts. And then, just as energy prices are predicted to soar, fracking becomes practical, and the future becomes again uncertain. Overnight, America appears to have become self-sufficient in energy for the foreseeable future. And there's enough oil and gas for the next 100 years. In truth, the glass is not half full or half empty. The glass is simply not big enough for all the oil that still remains in the rocks. So instead of energy prices soaring, in my view, they're on the verge of tumbling. Unexpectedly, America risks becoming a more attractive place for manufacturers than even China. Fracking is just part of the latest ingredient in the uncertainty of the continuing energy revolution. Right now, predictions have never been so uncertain. The fate of oil producers is up for auction, and oil prices themselves are once again edging towards becoming a speculator's dream. Uncertainty will inevitably breed contempt for the industry. Despite all its phenomenal achievements, oil is rarely portrayed by the media as a good news story. The public hate their dependence on oil. They loathe pollution, and they seize any opportunity to attack the oil corporations for profiteering. Our addiction to oil is the very reason that the oil industry is often its own worst enemy. Indeed, I often equate in my own mind our relationship with oil as like the story of a marriage. And here's a story which will explain what I mean. 7 years ago, I was in that wonderful city, now sadly being destroyed, Aleppo in Syria. We were in the souk, a most wonderful building which has now apparently been severely damaged. and my wife and children went off looking for any penalties. Oil is played for high stakes. The winner takes all and rarely takes hostages. Ever since the 1970s, when the Shah of Iran and then the OPEC countries tried to fix oil prices and guarantee their profits, inconvenient truths have rattled the producer's cage and have eventually undermined their plans. The markets invariably deliver the truth. Fixing the oil market was first tried by Rockefeller, a man of few scruples whose schemes to create Standard Oil encouraged the widespread distrust of all oil corporations which followed. All this competition, he once said, is crazy. It's ruining us. Over 100 years later, Exxon remains a company which takes no prisoners. Exxon does not seek to be loved. It has survived and prospered as the world's biggest and most profitable publicly owned oil corporation by being proudly combative. Governments who break contracts are sued. Lee Raymond cultivated Exxon's mystique by famously saying, "We are always right, but we are always misunderstood." He also added, "We don't run this company on emotions. We run it on science and principles." Exxon is an unsentimental company focused on its core business, the search and extraction of crude oil. They focus on persuading the oil-rich countries that it is in their best interest to entrust Exxon with producing their oil. The unique selling point about Exxon and their rival majors is their technical reliability. The less attractive side to the oil-rich nations is their insistence on earning profits. To their cost, several national oil companies, for example in Venezuela and Mexico, have expelled Exxon, and the consequences have been, as I will argue, counterproductive. The contradictory interests between the oil-producing states and the consuming countries undoubtedly are adverse influences on oil prices and the world's stability. The rivalry and potentially even warfare between those producers championing resource nationalism against those nations and corporations pursuing commercial interests can easily destabilize relationships. In the course of my speech, I will examine the vulnerability of all sides in this industry and why some solutions should be adopted rather than, as now, being ignored. Drilling for oil in Saudi Arabia is easy. Drilling for oil in Western Siberia also used to be easy. But when the Western oil majors arrived after 1989, they suspected that Russia's oil industry was, like its military services, upper volta with missiles. That image was conjured in the 1970s by Western intelligence, which compared that impoverished West African country with Soviet Russia. Even so, in 1989, few Western oil companies imagined the chaos they would discover in Russia's oil fields. Mediocrity and state control had suffocated genuine talent. In 1980, Russia had been producing around 2.85 million barrels of oil a day, but a decade later, the rate had fallen to less than half, 1.28 million barrels a day, and it was getting worse. Russia's oil engineers had carelessly damaged their oil wells. By 1989, the Russians had the corporations. Miller's efforts to take control were frustrated. There followed an uneasy truce. In Raymond's opinion, the standoff confirmed the reliability of ExxonMobil's model. Miller, of course, saw it differently. The fate of Russia's gas, he believed, should be determined by Russia, not by Exxon. Raymond's intransigence bore a cost. In 2005, Exxon lost the license to develop Sakhalin-3, and the Kremlin decided that the development of Stockman, an elephant oil and natural gas field 340 miles offshore in the Arctic, would not be licensed to an oil major as an owner, but only as a contractor. Raymond excluded Exxon from developing that project. On the win-some, lose-some equation, he was unconcerned that rejecting Russia's terms fettered the growth of energy supplies. Sakhalin 1, after all, had enhanced Exxon's reputation for excellence, and that skill was only available on Exxon's terms. For its part, the Russian government began searching for new partners to develop Sakhalin 3 and Stockman. The other oil majors all rejected the Kremlin's terms. Oil companies from India and Japan were considered, but finally Sakhalin 3's development has been shared with a minority stake sold to Sinopec of China. The huge question which we must address now is whether China and Russia can achieve the same outcome as Exxon. To date, experience suggests the answer is probably no. The consequences are intriguing. So far, Russia has offered comparatively unattractive terms to explore and develop the Arctic. It remains unclear whether the oil majors, offering their expertise at a price, will continue to resist contracts which prevent them earning a decent profit on their risks. Shell knows too well the cost of failure of exploration in the Canadian Arctic. The unanswered question is whether Russia will change its terms to attract investors, not only in the Arctic, but also for Stockman. While the Kremlin dithers and Russia's oil production falters, Gazprom also faces uncertainty about the future sales of natural gas. And in terms of supplying energy and politics, gas is more important than oil. Ever since the Ukraine blocked the transit of natural gas from Russia to Europe, Gazprom's customers in Western Europe have been nervous about the security of their supplies. Despite Gazprom spending over $40 billion on a pipeline around Ukraine, Germany and other countries have sought alternative supplies of LPG from Qatar and Indonesia, and now Gazprom faces competition from fracking. America's fracking has terrified Russia. 3 years ago, Alexei Miller dismissed the optimistic scenarios about fracking as a myth and a well-planned propaganda campaign. The Saudis, for their part, confidently predicted that America's bonanza would peak in 2020. Both countries, motivated by self-interest, spouted wishful thinking to dismiss the idea that America might once again become the world's biggest energy producer. After all, even Raymond had announced in 2003 gas production has peaked in North America. His successor, Rex Tillerson, confirmed that America would never again enjoy energy independence. But Exxon's oil men proved to be poor to the Kazakh government to the problems of developing the huge Kashgan field. Instead of entrusting the development to an experienced major, the Kazakh government allowed Eni of Italy to manage the project. Lacking the necessary experience and tainted by corruption, Eni led the consortium into a morass, which has so far cost over $45 billion, is 8 years behind schedule, and no one can accurately predict when production of oil will actually start. Eni has now been replaced by Shell, but instead of allowing the majors to develop the fields and be rewarded with proper financial incentives, the Kazakh government constantly interferes, demanding that key equipment be purchased locally in a country which is famous for goat herds. Those demands postpone further the windfall Kazakhstan desperately needs. Kazakhstan's ambitions risk becoming a bottomless pit of wasteful investment. In my opinion, one lesson can be drawn. Only a handful of major oil corporations have the expertise to develop the difficult oil and gas reserves, yet resource nationalism is delaying that exploitation. And now, along come the Chinese Energy Corporation. China needs oil for the huge increase of vehicles and generators powering private homes. So far, its own search for oil off the Chinese coast has been relatively disappointing. Beijing's response to the country's growing demand is interesting. Instead of buying oil and the products of the market, like most countries, China wants to own its own oil, to feel certain it has a guaranteed security of supply. The Chinese appear to be executing a master plan. Contracts with Russia, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan have guaranteed some supplies. Some say that China wants to buy no less than 40% of Kazakhstan's gas and oil production. As some of you well know, India's hopes in Kazakhstan were frustrated by China's diplomacy. When Conoco sold out of Kazakhstan, China stepped in. But realizing China's ambitions will not be plain sailing. China may well have claims to be emerging as the world's #1 economic superpower, but oil and gas is one industry where competition from the West will be hard to beat. The battle lines have been drawn. To the surprise of many in Britain, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, visited Kazakhstan last June. His intention was to reinforce the status and interests of Britain's oil industry. Other Western leaders have done the same. China is engaged in a tough game, not only in Asia, but across Africa and South America. Superficially, China seems to have established an impressive position, signing exclusive contracts to own sizable amounts of oil and minerals. In a very brief period, China has developed respectable assets upstream, midstream, and refineries at the end. The country's oil corporations have also developed an impressive series of drilling rigs. Pertinently, when they buy into an oil field, they bring their own labor, like in Angola and Sudan, and the costs then become, in Western terms, incalculable. Are they higher or lower than the equivalent market rates? But we don't know, and that conduct raises many questions. Firstly, to some, China, it appears, is paying often over the odds for their supplies. If, as I expect and will explain, oil and gas prices fall, China's energy costs will be rising just as America's costs fall, pricing Chinese goods out of the market.